Okay, welcome back from Thanksgiving break. Spatial Shark here. Another quick video for Unit 4. This should be video number 7 of 8, so we're almost there. This video we're going to be talking about supranationalism, and then in that last video we're going to be talking about devolution. So these two forces are very interesting in contemporary political geography. Supranationalism is the work of 3 or more countries working together for some common goal. Almost always it's going to be economic. Historically, we know that countries will work together in alliances like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led opposition to that NATO alliance in the Cold War. But this is nothing new. You could go all the way back to, if you take AP European history, you'll probably talk about the Zollverein, a group of German states that were common weights and measures and trade and things like that. So these organizations are nothing new. But supranationalism is very obvious in the world today because there's so many problems that just can't be handled by one state alone, and they need to cooperate, they need to work together. And you can see this again in things like combating poverty and disease in the world, climate change, security in the face of terrorism and extremism. All of these things are good examples of supranational goals. One thing you need to remember, anytime a state voluntarily joins a group, they're going to have to give up some degree of their sovereignty, because if you join, for example, a free trade zone, you're giving up your right to tax and tariff and put restrictions on that trade. So anytime you join a group, you have to give up some degree of your sovereignty. There are a lot of these organizations in the world today, and we'll talk about them. I always say we have to know alphabet soup to be able to understand all these different supranational organizations. One other alphabet soup that is similar but not the same is what we call NGOs. And these are not a farmer with a dog, that's BINGO, but these are NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And the big difference here is that these are outside of state government. So these are private, charitable type organizations. Bono with his One Foundation that fights against debt in Africa and AIDS, and really strives to improve the development of sub-Saharan African countries. Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, the World Wildlife Fund. I put a bunch of them here in the slideshow. These are all NGOs. And sometimes they can be more effective at solving problems because they don't have to wait for political consensus. They don't have to get something passed through a legislature. They can act much more quickly and sometimes more effectively with the money that they raise. We also need to be mindful of transnational or multinational corporations, because sometimes big companies like Apple, Walmart, Amazon, they can sometimes be just as powerful, if not more powerful, than state governments because of their access to billions of dollars in revenue, job creation. Sometimes they can exert a tremendous amount of pressure on state governments because of their big economic clout. So we'll talk real quick about this global economy, and certainly we need to talk about networks and how they disseminate information, how we can access that information through the internet, through social media, with pop cultural influencers. It's probably important that we talk real quickly about vertical and horizontal integration of companies. Again, if you've taken any kind of an American history class, or will as your junior year, you're going to learn a lot about a big company called Standard Oil, the Rockefellers, and how he built that company originally through horizontal integration by buying up other oil companies, but then ultimately through vertical integration, controlling the railways, controlling the factories, controlling the production of the oil, the sale of the oil, the marketing of the oil. And at that time it was big kerosene, but one of the first companies to realize the byproduct of that petroleum, gasoline, which of course now our country is very dependent on that because of how much we love our cars. So there's all kinds of cool examples of what we call vertical integration, where a company owns all steps of the process, all control of the process. Horizontal integration is where you have several companies that are related to each other, but they all operate at the same level. In other words, they're all restaurants like Yum Brands, that's Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, KFC, that's all part of the same company. Or you ever notice when you go to like Home Goods and TJ Maxx, they're always next door to each other. other. That's because they're the same company. So when you have a vertical integration, they control everything, forward and backward linkages through the supply chain, from the manufacturing, the sourcing of the product, all the way to the marketing and the distribution and the delivery to the consumer. So when you think about these companies, they have a tremendous amount of influence through their commercials and through their products. This is a good example of a chart that shows you what vertical and horizontal integration might look like. And in this case, we're talking about a car company, something like maybe Ford. Back in the day, Henry Ford not only had the idea for revolutionizing the manufacturing of the car with the the assembly line and the interchangeable parts, but he also owned the coal mines that produced the heat that ran the machines. He owned the steel mills. He had the iron ore. He owned the boats that shipped everything to the River Rouge plant in Michigan. He owned the dealers. Everything was under the control of Ford. It was a big vertical operation. Today, Apple is somewhat like that. Right? You buy the phone from Apple. Apple made the phone. Apple is going to sell you the phone. Apple's going to service your phone through like iCare. They're going to sell you content for your phone through the iTunes store. Everything is controlled top to bottom from Apple itself. Horizontal integration, as I mentioned before, would be companies that are at the same level of the product in terms of its supply chain. And when we talk about horizontal integration, these are sometimes competitors, but they are again owned by the same company, and they're looking for economies of scale in that sense. Don't forget forward and backward linkages. If it gets closer to you, the consumer, that's a forward linkage. If it goes back towards the commodity itself, the raw material, that's a backwards linkage. And those are big important in terms of the global economy, because oftentimes the source of the raw material is in a lesser developed country. Certainly the manufacturing is often in less developed countries, but the marketing and the management and those kinds of things is often done in the wealthier countries like the United States and Europe and Japan. This is a great example of a bunch of companies that are structured in the sense of what we call horizontal integration. In other words, these are all kind of food companies, and look at what they also own. They own tons of other food companies and health and beauty aids and things like that as well. But these are all consumer services kind of companies. And so you can see that they're all structured where, there may be competitors on the shelf, but sometimes they're owned by the same company. Apple, of course, a good example of one that I mentioned was vertical, because Apple, they control everything, the making of the battery, the design of the new products, everything from the content that's on the phone to the actual materials that go into making the phone, and the plastic and the glass and the rare earths and the minerals that go into making the different chips and the wafers and everything that controls your phone. We also should talk about supranationalism in the sense of in the modern world. So really what has happened since the end of World War I was the idea that there needed to be an international organization to maintain peace and security in the world. And so the idea was that there would be no more war. This is a big, Woodrow Wilson was the champion of this idea, self-determination for all states, and then a big world body that would ensure peace and tranquility. So the League of Nations was formed. The biggest problem with it was that the United States never joined. When Wilson came back from Europe and signing the Treaty of Versailles, Congress did not ratify it or approve it, and so therefore the United States never was a member of this League of Nations. And then, of course, the League proved to be pretty weak when it came to aggressive territorial ambitions. For example, Italy invading Ethiopia, Japan invading Manchuria. Hitler's watching all of this. Remember, he had been elected as Chancellor of Germany, and he saw that the League had no appetite for enforcing territorial integrity or the security of the member states. So as a result, the League basically proved to be ineffective and weak. World War II, of course, comes about as a result of that weakness. After the end of World War II, kind of like a reboot of this idea with the United Nations. And this time the United States played a tremendously important role. And of course, as you know from what we talked about in class last week, there is the Security Council. The 5 permanent members of that Security Council are the winners of World War II, the United States, Great Britain, France, and then of course the People's Republic of China and Russia. Today Russia, of course, at the time it would have been the Soviet Union. The main role of this UN, of course, is expensive peacekeeping operations, and they've done this in many different parts of the world over the last 50 to 60 years. And of course, they also do many other things. They work for development in terms of economic development and social welfare development in poor countries, education, children's health care, the status of women. There's all kinds of things that the UN is doing to push development around the world. But the most expensive job is, again, solving issues of conflict in the world, particularly in Asia, Africa, and Middle East particularly. So when you see the permanent members of the UN, basically everybody belongs. Remember, we talked the other day about Vatican City having an observer status. Palestine has observer status right now, so they have a seat in the big General Assembly, but they do not yet have a vote. And of course, here's the addition of countries. As Africa becomes independent during the decade of the 60s, lots of new countries are added to the UN. As the Soviet Union falls apart in the 90s, lots of new countries are added into the UN. But this map basically just shows you pretty much that everybody belongs. We could also change scale, and we could talk about supranationalism less on an international or global level and more of a regional example. And this is a good example, the EU. Starting from the late 40s, early 50s, 3 tiny little countries in Europe, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, agreed to get together and work as a common economy. And they became known as the Benelux Agreement. Clever little name, right? Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. Well, their neighbors noticed that they were doing really well, and so France, West Germany at the time, and Italy said, hey, could we join and create a bigger, better version of your little Benelux Agreement? And they began to call it the European Economic Community. By the time of the 80s, that group had grown to 12. It became known as the Common Market. Great Britain had joined, even Greece was in, and so they changed their name again to the European Community. They dropped that E for economic, meaning that they now have a vision of being more than just a free trade kind of a zone. By the 90s, they had changed the name to a much more strong sounding European Union. And they started to have this amazing idea, let's remove borders, let's allow people to move around. Remember the Schengen Agreement with the sexy Polish plumbers, a common currency to create a Eurozone, all of those kinds of things. And it was really accelerating into this idea that, hey, maybe this could be like a United States of Europe kind of a concept. Well, this is where the British started to become a little bit concerned. Remember, the British never accepted the common currency. They always maintained their British pound. Being on an island, they really didn't exactly buy into this whole idea of unity so much. And now you're seeing, of course, since 2016, this idea of Brexit, or the British exit from the EU. It's already been voted on. It's already been agreed by the electorate, although now there's a lot of second thoughts, and they're kicking the can down the road, and there's a lot of delays, and they're negotiating extensions, and people are saying maybe we should vote again, and the European Union doesn't want to give them a great deal to get out, and now will there be a deal? Is there no deal? What about the Irish backstop? Which, you think about the island of Ireland, it's not one state. Ireland is there, but there's also Northern Ireland, which belongs to the UK. So this idea of a backstop, remember, borders are not supposed to exist anymore within the EU, but if Great Britain leaves the EU, then what do you do about the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland? And of course, the Irish people, they don't want walls. They don't want big barriers there. They've had those walls, and they've had problems with conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland, so they don't necessarily want to go back to that. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what the EU is looking like at its kind of biggest extent, big problems again with Brexit, the economies of Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, all really having tough times with high unemployment. And of course, Germany and France, the biggest economies, have had to bail out some of those weaker economies, and that is dragging down on their economy as well. Again, immigration is a big issue within the EU today, particularly repatriation of some of these people that have gone to the Middle East in terms of ISIS. And what do we do now in terms of integrating these people back into European countries where they might have left from? A lot of issues that still have to be ironed out in terms of that EU. So in terms of using the Eurozone, a lot more people use the currency and are members, but the currency is the big issue, because if you streamline your currencies together, you're pretty much tying your economies to each other for good or for bad. It's almost like that marriage in the sense of for better or for worse. So where do we go in terms of the future? And we've already talked about a few of these things in class, but Putin is concerned about the EU. He's concerned about the continued expansion into Eastern Europe because you have former Soviet satellite states that are now members of the EU, and increasingly important, also members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is the U.S.-led alliance. If you attack one, you've attacked all, and this is where the United States is propping up and selling military hardware and equipment to countries like Poland. You certainly see the Baltic states and Finland also becoming more aligned in that sense. So when you think about the effect of European supranationalism in the future, does this minimize the chance for conflict, or does it create opportunities for more conflict? And that is going to be very interesting. Political cartoons, of course, often can give you a glimpse into what people are thinking. This is a great one. It's Pandora's Box, and this was the EU referendum, stay or leave, and they were asking the British, do you want to stay in a little England, keep your sovereignty, but you won't have all the trade advantages? Big Europe instead is saying, hey, you have all these excellent opportunities for free trade and free migration, but notice it's an octopus and all the tentacles and getting tangled up in all these European problems. And once you open that Pandora's box, you really can't close it again. So she's basically said, no, we do not want to be part of this EU. And now it's like, well, could you repeat the question? One of the most Googled searches after the referendum vote on the EU was, what does Brexit mean? This is another kind of funny one in the sense that this is your Greek warrior, and he's using the euro coin as a shield. The European Central Bank is his weapon, right? And kind of like Achilles, he's been hit in the weak heel, right? The only place that he could really be hurt. And it kind of reminds me, of if you ever see the old Monty Python movies, it's only a flesh wound, right? But from that little tiny point in the ankle, he's going to bleed out. And this is kind of basically saying that the Greek economy and meltdown is going to drag down the entire European economy, because again, they're all linked together by that common currency and by their economic partnership in that sense. Supranationalistic groups elsewhere, there are a bunch of these. Remember, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is no more, but we do have a successor. It has not yet been ratified by the U.S. Congress. Mexico actually did ratify it, still waiting on the U.S. and Canada, but they have agreed to it, and the new name will be the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Basically, it's essentially a different version of the same free trade agreement. But again, never we're going to have a common currency, never we're going to remove border restrictions. Those things were never really on the table in terms of the USMCA. Also talking about, for example, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is not just the Middle East. Nigeria and Venezuela both belong to that. So supranationalism is strong all over the world. There's a lot of countries that work together. But again, this pendulum swings back and forth sometimes between cooperation and unilateral, make America great again, we're going to do it by ourselves, in terms of things like climate change, in terms of things like combating terrorism. So this is kind of where the geopolitical element comes in. Do you work together or do you go it alone? And these are just some good examples that you should be aware of in case you get a question about supranationalism.